Right. Happy New Year, everyone. A warm welcome, colleagues, fellow educators, and our new graduate students to NIE. I am Mary Ann Heng. I'm an Associate Dean at NIE, and I would like to begin by congratulating you, in particular, our graduate students, and particularly those who have come afar. Our international graduate students. I didn't do a count, but I'm quite sure we have people from many countries joining here, and we are actually growing our international student group year by year. So congratulations as you begin your studies at NIE, and a warm welcome as part of the NIE family. We begin with the NIE Teachers College Symposium 2020 with the theme Changing Conceptions of Youth, School and Work. This symposium celebrates the special partnership between NIE NTU and Teachers College Columbia University over close to a decade. Two institutions with a rich tradition and a shared vision of excellence, innovation, ideals, and values. Our first speaker, Professor Nancy Lesko, is the Maxine Green Professor of Education at Teachers College Columbia University in the United States. Nancy's scholarly interests include curriculum theory and history, conceptions of children and youth, contemporary citizenship education, and affect studies in education, and her publications are in these areas. Please welcome Professor Nancy Lesko, who will speak on the very exciting topic, Alternative Conceptions of Adolescence as a Basis for Curriculum.
And I should use this microphone. All right. Hi, everyone. I'm a little surprised by how many of you are here. I'm not used to, the classes that I generally teach are a little bit smaller in size, so I'm not used to looking up when I speak, so I'll try. I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to speak to all of you. Thank you to Mary Ann and all the other folks and the Malik program who made this, and elsewhere, who made this possible. So I'm going to try to make an argument in my short talk this afternoon. And I'm going to try to argue that we need to turn away from some things that we've been doing in schools, in secondary schools, and to argue for a turning towards some other things. And I'm really using that language of turning to indicate that the final destination is by no means determined or figured out by me, or I would say anybody else in education, and interested in conceptions of youth and practices that relate to curriculum. So I want to talk about turning away from, I think, overly rigid ideas of behavior in secondary schools, often, at least in the US context, called zero tolerance or no excuses practices. And to move also to turn away from a narrowing of curriculum that I think is related to global competition around schooling, as well as accountability, again in the US, more stringent processes of accountability, and to argue for a turning toward emphasizing matters of concern in curriculum, so moving away from those disciplinary ideas of the disciplines and separation of the disciplines that I think we're all very well acquainted with and often love in many different ways, and yet that I think are kind of a trap. And also turning towards an emphasis towards active engagement. So curriculum and curricular knowledge is more active engagement. So I start today with coming with a background in the field of curriculum or studies of curriculum studies, history of curriculum, And it takes a very broad view of curriculum. So the word curriculum you might be more familiar with as kind of synonymous with a textbook or with the kind of written down, these are objectives for particular classes or a particular year of study. And the view that I take is this broader one, which is that curriculum is composed of all the intended but also unintended lessons and learnings experienced both by individual young people in schools as well as by groups of students. And that idea comes from Herb Kleebart as well as other people, but especially Herb. So I want to start with a recent story in this first idea of moving away from rigid behavioral controls in secondary schools, which I see as absolutely part of the curriculum. So I want to start with this recent story in the BBC about Japanese schools and the escalating numbers of students who refuse to attend schools in Japan. And that this what still is often called absenteeism, is on the rise, according to this BBC report, due to bullying, but also unreasonable rules, such as very specific dress codes. And so in last August, and this is what the article was about, a campaign group called Let's Get Rid of Black School Rules, which they defined as unreasonable school rules, submitted a petition and also got an investigation, at least in Osaka Prefecture, into unreasonable school rules. And in the U.S., these unreasonable, in Japan apparently they're called unreasonable school rules or black school rules. In the U.S., the term zero tolerance or no excuses is much more common. And these policies have been put into schools, assuming that targeting small infractions of school rules, such as dress code, speaking out of turn, not walking in a line, not walking silently through corridors, is going to kind of have this domino effect that it will become larger and larger. There'll be, if you stop the small infractions, that this will lead to a minimization of larger ones, or perhaps a preemption of larger ones altogether. So these theories, as some of you may know, come from zero tolerance or no excuses. Practices come from a theory in criminology called broken windows theory, which is this idea that if the police in a particular area, again, kind of pay attention to small infractions, such as broken windows, or people not paying for the subway, sort of jumping over the subway gates, for example, that by paying attention to that, they will be able to avoid and to preempt even larger kinds of disorder. And in school, this has meant an encouragement of kind of clamping down on a range of different kinds of school practices, such as, or a discipline, I guess. Language, so there have been clamping down on language codes, which involve governing slang, so students are punished for using particular kinds of words or curse words or slang, speaking out of turn. Classroom etiquette, sort of students are expected to sit up straight, to track the teacher with their eyes, because that shows that they're following, engaged. The personal dress, so uniforms, little or no jewelry, and then these kind of more broad behavior codes, walking in silent lines, specified bathroom times, etc. And so again, these have been put into place in part in the US with the rationalization that we're preventing larger kinds of school violence. However, we could call them unintended consequences. So Monique Morris, an educational researcher, in her book called Push Out, shows how these no excuse policies have had an impact specifically on Black girls in secondary schools, literally pushing them out of the school. That's the title of her book. So, for example, has anecdotes about that black girls may complain about how they're being treated, that someone took something from them and they're punished because they're speaking out of turn. Or they try to talk with a teacher perhaps about a grade or a late assignment or an understanding about some other nuance going on in the classroom, and they're again punished for somehow speaking out of order. Morris also talks a lot about how black girls' bodies are policed. They're judged as overly sexualized and therefore unlike a proper schoolgirl, and that might include hair, earrings, or other jewelry, language, and loudness. So, as I said, this is a poll from Phi Delta Kappan, which is a journal published monthly in the U.S. that's specifically focused on education and education policy. And this poll or chart from a poll is 2019, so it's relatively recent. And you can see across teachers, across parents, and across all adults, that zero tolerance policies are still very popular, with 70% or higher being in support of them. And so that's that was kind of my what I'm trying to make this argument for today is that we need to consider what we're doing in these overly stringent policing of young people's bodies and their ability to talk in certain kinds of ways and situations, to dress with at least some kind of, perhaps some input. And it's not that I wore uniforms, so I'm not against uniforms necessarily. But I think that the way that these have come to be overly rigid, sort of as expressed in the article about Japanese schools and also expressed in the US with Monique Morris's book, is problematic for lots of students. Not for all, but for lots of students. And a second area that I'm also kind of arguing for this turning toward is turning away from narrow conceptions of the academic curriculum. So the more common use of the term curriculum has to do with the studying of science, mathematics, physical education, languages, literature, history, etc. And I think my kind of starting points here are the rise of, and perhaps they've always been there, but perhaps more it's like the urgency of big concerns for the future, the planet, society. So the fires in Australia are just the latest example of the planetary urgency around studying knowledge and actions around climate. I think in the US, again, Black Lives Matter, a movement to protest and to try to change policies around that specifically have focused on police shooting of young Black men and women. The Me Too movement, operating around awareness of both sexual harassment, but also inequality around gender in the workplace, in salaries, etc., in opportunities. And then and these are just examples of March for Our Lives, which started by a movement started by young people in the U.S. in favor of gun control. So it was started, or it's located in Marjorie Stoneman High School in Florida, where 17 of their colleagues were killed several years ago. And I think to sort of take these matters of concern, which seem pressing, urgent, and of interest, I think, to many, many people, and to contrast that with what I would say has been, again, over the last, again, primarily from the US perspective, this narrowing and continued fragmentation of the academic curriculum, so that we get ever narrower, we go more into depth in advanced placement courses in chemistry, advanced placement courses in world history, etc., which is all, of course, important, but I think that, that in that move into ever greater depth and narrowness, we lose kind of the potential to interest young people and to engage with where young people already are and some of their interests and concerns, which I think are related to these what I call big concerns. So in trying to make these turns that I'm arguing for, the first thing that I would say that I think is important in making this turn and just beginning to literally turn in a different direction is that adults, educators like all of us, I think all of us in the room, parents, legislators, politicians, I think have to confront, first of all, our own what I call affective or emotional investments in particular ideas of young people, our fears, our worries about, well, if we get rid of zero tolerance or no excuses, will there be more, in the US context at least, will there be more shootings in schools? Right, that some of these things have been put in place because of particular worries and fears, and so those worries and fears get activated as we imagine going in a different direction. I think also anxieties about how young people kind of view us as fossils, boomers, people kind of out of the loop, not up to the minute in all kinds of popular cultural, fashion, etc. stuff. But also, I think as adults, we're accustomed to some power, even though often in our jobs we might complain about we don't feel like we have very much power. But I think taking a long view, looking across secondary schooling, I think that things like the tradition, the canon of what's to be taught in literature, the canon of what's to be taught and learned in history, our ages, university degrees, and then policies like zero tolerance, standardized tests, all kind of give us a particular kind of power, or perhaps different ways of a little bit of authority, power over young people. And so I think in making this turn that I'm arguing for today towards rethinking rigidities and narrowness of curricula, I think the first thing, or at least one of the things we have to do, is confront our own attitudes about young people and whether we think they're competent and what they're competent and capable of. Yes. There we go. Okay. Okay. All right. So I'm going to move into, I have a few minutes left, and I'm going to move into giving a few examples. Again, in making using this language of the turning, I'm very intentionally not saying here's the plan, here's the criteria for the right way, for the approach that clearly is what we need. But I see this as really an urge in part, an argument in part for experimentation. And so first of all is drawing from Henry Jenkins, who's somebody who works in media studies and participatory culture, is looking for spaces or creating spaces in which the divisions between adult and youth are a little less defined, a little bit perhaps there's a little bit more informality, some more intergenerational negotiation, and blurring of age distinctions. And that can happen in school, but I think it can also happen outside of school. So one example, or some, and again, these aren't full-blown examples, so it comes again from Henry Jenkins and his colleagues' work on participatory media culture. And I think they start with this idea that, or countering an adult-centric established idea of what counts as political engagement. And they really argue that things like online fan clubs and online activism around, for example, immigration issues, that show it is a particular kind of political involvement and social participation, and they think they argue that this is also, we can also see examples of civic imagination at work. And so they basically are trying to convince us, Jenkins and his colleagues, that shifts in communication, specifically digital age, have unleashed a new political dynamism in American youth. So a second kind of turning could be informed by one of my colleagues at Teachers College in science education, Chris Emden, who writes about what he calls reality pedagogy. And it attempts to, which he defines as trying to honor and incorporate young people's knowledge and expertise into curriculum design and classroom practices. And again, rather than starting with adults, what adults want, what standardized tests want, to try to engage young people in this determination of the curriculum. And so he has many different kinds of processes that he recommends. Just to talk about three really briefly. One is what he calls co-generative dialogues. The idea is that teachers, in a systematic basis, try to meet with a range of students, those who like your subject, those who maybe are not so liking your subject, so different kinds of relationships with the classroom and with your particular subject area, for example, to talk about, to get their feedback on how things are going. So this idea is that it's not just an assessment, it's just not at the end of the course, well, what did you think about the class and what were the best activities, right? We're all familiar with those kinds of things. But this co-generative, that it really is along while the course is still going on. He also writes about co-teaching and cosmopolitanism as other ways to begin to create these spaces, not that they're there all the time, but where young people and adults have, at least in certain situations, sort of equal say, equal opportunity to influence the decisions that are made. A third kind of I would say advice almost in this case comes from Elizabeth Soap's work. She's been directing a youth radio program outside of San Francisco for probably 20 years now. And one of the things she talks about is in the difficulty of trying to work in some ways that are where young people and adults are positioned as equal. She's developed this concept of pedagogy of collegiality, a relationship of shared collective responsibility. And she writes a lot about how difficult that is, that to either, give young people a complete say or to hold all the reins as an adult or as a teacher are way easier. And she said that this ongoing negotiation is very, obviously very important and crucial to this youth radio that she's been working with for so long, but also to this idea of trying to establish times and spaces in which adults and young people can kind of come together with some similar power or ability to influence the outcome. And the final example comes from teachers in a school in New York City who have used just traditional English literature class to get young people involved in Black Lives Matter movement, Say Her Name. And so the taking of a very traditional class, such as English literature, and reading some, in this instance, Black feminist theory, going to see some speakers in New York when they're there, talking about these ideas, and then creating an online space, a blog, where students can then begin to bring these connections between readings, speakers, their own experiences, etc. So again, a place where young people get to have a space and time where they can make their own connections. It's not in a vacuum, obviously, but this blogging space has worked very well in this instance. So I'm going to close with a particular image. So I've been arguing for a turning away from these relatively restrictive ideas of school policies, especially around bodies and movement in schools, and away from a relatively narrow curriculum and segmented curriculum towards matters of concern and towards curricular experiences that begin to open up some possibilities for young people to create, to construct knowledge, to utilize knowledge, to mobilize knowledge, to do some of the things that they believe in. And so I'm going to draw on an image that a French philosopher, Michel Serres, uses, Thumbelina. A teenage girl using her thumbs to connect via social media. And I think, we all immediately have images that pop into our minds, right? We all have seen Thumbelina and her companions, Tom Thumb. But what Michel Serres is trying to do is to try to think about, well, what kinds of knowledge and what kinds of actions and what kinds of power make sense to Thumbelina, and those may not be the knowledge and the actions and the power that made sense to people who set up schooling in its present form. And one of the things that Serres talks about is that Thumbelina is maybe going to rely a lot more on intuition because she has literally everything at her fingertips, all kinds of knowledge. She doesn't have to memorize anything. And kind of then Serres kind of goes into, well, what does that intuition, how might we think about as educators engaging with that intuition, and what kinds of interests and directions and ideas and energies might those intuitions kind of flow into and perhaps flow away from as well. So I think that the challenge for educators and for people who think about secondary school curriculum, again broadly defined, is to think about Thumbelina and Tom Thumb and how those experiences, their lives, their access to knowledge, may change, may be part of a stimulus, perhaps a prodding, for us to kind of turn away from these practices that we've been operating on for the last 20 or so years, I would say, and towards some experimentation that might be more engaging for Thumbelina and her colleagues. Thank you very much.
Before I introduce the next speaker, I hope you've been beginning to reflect on the fascinating ideas and that Nancy has begun to share with us, and issues to do with reality, pedagogy, power, new terms that we're learning. And that I think you begin to realize that in graduate school, we raise these issues about what's pressing, what's urgent, to encourage educators to question the status quo about what could be alternative, what could be changing, and even what's normal. And as we grapple with the present and look to the future, we don't only look at studies that are local, and hence a session like this. We are open to studies done internationally, to new ideas that challenge us and maybe sometimes cause us some degree of discomfort. So we hope you bring your experiences and keep thinking, questioning, raising those questions as you begin to think about your place in graduate education, whether you are doing a math graduate program or a doctoral program, etc. So we'll have a short panel discussion at the end of the second talk, so you can begin to jot down some of your questions that you may want to pose at the end of the session. All right? So our next speaker, Mark Wilden, is Associate Dean, Office of Education Research and Associate Professor in Humanities and Social Studies Education at the National Institute of Education, Nanyang Technological University. Mark's scholarly interests focus on ways to support social studies inquiry practices, global citizenship education, and 21st century literacies in new global contexts. Please welcome Professor Mark Wilden, who will speak about finding purpose and meaning in education amidst emerging trends in education.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Marianne and GPL, for this opportunity to share a little bit of my thinking about meaning and purpose amidst some of the emerging trends that we're starting to see both in work as well as in education. Let's see. So just to give you a little bit of a roadmap, I'll start out by introducing some of my more recent work around meaning and purpose, as well as a concept around stories we live by that I'll share with you. And I want you to try to apply that to think about some of the stories that we're hearing about the future of work as well as about education, both here in Singapore as well as internationally. And then we'll talk about trends in education, and we'll conclude, I'll share a little bit about NIE's 4-Life framework. So one of the projects that I'm just really initiating is with Marianne as well as Johannes Abdulaziz, who's sitting over there. And we're looking at meaning and purpose in Singapore society. And we want to understand what society's leaders in various sectors across Singapore society think about the future of work and the role of education in preparing young people for the world of work, as well as helping instill a sense of purpose as they look at their future. We're hoping that this will cascade into other, talking to other people as well. But we've had about 4 or 5 interviews so far, and they've been just fascinating. So we're talking to leaders in industry, as well as in public policy, civil society, different walks of life. But we want to look at how their thinking about meaning and purpose is influenced by this notion of the future of work. What's the relationship between the future of work and meaning and purpose in young people's lives, as well as, how might that help us think about education, the role of education. So how do these understandings of meaning and purpose, or lack thereof, affect the ways we think about the education system and the purposes of the education system? So this is one project. So this is, we're just getting this off the ground, so this is kind of an opportunity for me to think through this a little bit more. The second project that I'm working on is related to climate justice literacy. And we're using a concept that comes out of the UK from Eco-Linguistics by Aaron Steeb, who works in the UK. And we're using this idea of stories we live by. And so I'm going to ask you to apply this to thinking about the future of work as well as the future of education. Stories we live by are both individual as well as collective. Stories are what give our lives meaning and purpose in many cases, but they're also at a national level or even a global level. They're what help us feel a sense of belonging often. So this idea of stories we live by are mental models about the world that we live in, and we see them everywhere. These stories are everywhere. They're in texts of all kinds, advertisements, news stories, the conversations that we have, our textbooks. So what we're looking at are texts, but we're also looking at the kinds of conversations that pre-service teachers are having when they teach climate change. So we're trying to better understand how they think about the climate, how they think about the world through some of these kinds of stories in terms of the ways they interpret different kinds of texts like YouTube videos and websites and things of that nature. They also appear in educational and other social institutions as well. So they're really very deeply ingrained and sort of deeply embedded in our psyches, but also in our social institutions. And so one of the things that we're doing as we look at this is we're trying to identify different kinds of stories that we're hearing about climate and how people think about climate change and climate justice. And so just to give you a couple of examples to kind of help you start to think about stories we live by, we see a very anthropocentric story in which humans are separate from nature. So I think the classic example is the SUVs that are running roughshod over the earth, and the earth is sort of the playground. And this is a quote by Christopher Lasch, who was a professor of mine at the University of Rochester, in which the world is really seen as something that just purely exists for human gratification, human desires, that kind of notion. So this is one kind of story that we're seeing in a lot of texts. And again, these are bound up in narratives of progress that go way back to the Industrial Revolution, for example. It's how we think of material progress throughout history in some ways, and we continue to live by these stories. Another story that we find is quite destructive is that consumerism is the main path to happiness, to really purpose. And probably the epitome of this is when President George Bush in the United States, after the 9/11 attack, kind of said, we can't let the terrorists win, go back shopping, So this idea that consumerism, shopping is the main path to happiness, which is really no longer sustainable, is another story that comes out of a lot of texts that we see, whether it's in advertisements or other kinds of stories. The other thing that we're doing is locating and exploring what we are terming beneficial stories to live by. And these are stories that are ultimately more empowering, more about civic agency, more about making change. And we see this in a lot of climate justice movements. The one picture, lower right hand, right here, this is in Singapore. And so we see young people in particular across the planet really stepping up and taking action about climate change. We consider these beneficial stories to live by. Okay? So do you have the idea of stories to live by? You kind of that sort of notion? So what I'm going to ask you to do is to apply stories we live by, and it can be applied to research as well. A lot of you are going to be engaging with different kinds of research, but I think it's important or helpful, actually, to think about research as telling particular kinds of stories. So research findings tell stories. They are really insightful and useful in terms of helping us think about ourselves, what we do, and so on. Social scientific and educational research is more or less helpful to help us understand the social world as we navigate our way through it. And the last point, and this is also from a professor of mine at Michigan State University, Cleo Cherry-Holmes, in an article titled Reading Research, which I would recommend as you enter into graduate school. But the stories that researchers tell are subject to multiple readings. So the thing to keep in mind is that there's a lot of different ways that we can read stories that represent our reality or the world or even ourselves. So try to keep those in mind, that there's multiple readings, there's different readings, and I'm going to ask you to, as we look at the future of work, for example, what are some of the stories that are being conveyed? What are stories that are implied about education? What might be the consequences of those? So we'll use the pragmatic method articulated by people like John Dewey and Charles Sanders Peirce. It is really about thinking about what are the conceivable consequences of these kinds of stories? What kind of impact might they make on the ways that we think about ourselves and the ways that we think about the world? And so take a look at this. Let's unpack this a little bit. But if you look at the top, and these diagrams, most of them come from the Deloitte Review, which really gives kind of a good sense of their conception or their stories about the future of work and the role of education in that. But if you look at the top, You can see some of these forces of change. Basically, technology, and I'm going to talk mostly about technology, but also demographic changes. We have aging populations, but with immigration, we're seeing much more diverse societies, and that's impacting societies in profound ways. And then the power of pull, which is, again, around, sort of these global markets and consumer or customer satisfaction. And then we see that work and workforces are completely being redefined and transformed. And that's coming down to the lower level here, where we see implications for individuals, for organizations, as well as for public policy. And so if you take a look at this, and this is the exercise that I went through in your mind, what are some of the stories that jump out at you as you look at this? Well, I'll help you out a little bit. First of all, I think it's a story of disruption. So that the ways that we've been working and the ways that we've been living our lives are being profoundly disrupted. They're being unsettled. And we're seeing a great deal of disruption really around the world, not just in terms of work, but in terms of, certain kinds of social upheavals, populist movements. And this is going to require, I think in some ways, disruption, certainly by business leaders, disruption is seen as a positive force. It's a transformative force. It's going to bring about significant change. The other one is lifelong learning, and I think this image here is pretty apt. We tend to look at this as it's a matter of survival now. We've got to continue to be lifelong learners, both as individuals as well as organizations. Otherwise, we stagnate, we're going to be left behind, these kinds of things. So these are a couple of the stories, but are there different readings? And so just to provide my own reading of some of these, first of all, it's highly speculative. I mean, these are predictions. We're not quite sure what the future holds for us. I mean, there's certain kinds of trends that we can anticipate, possibly. But, we have to be a little bit careful around some of the optimism, I think, around the uses of technology. There's a certain kind of techno-optimism that we're seeing. The other thing is that we also have to think about how technologies produce unintended consequences. Sometimes we don't know what happens when we unleash these technologies into the world, and there's certain kinds of risks. And people like Ulrich Beck have been writing about this, about risk society and the kinds of dangers that technologies actually bring. And we're seeing some of that, I think, in terms, not just nuclear technologies and not just in terms of some of the ways that technologies are impacting climate, but it's also in terms of social media, in terms of some of the bullying, in terms of disinformation campaigns that are confusing people, in terms of gaming, spending way too much time online, these kinds of things, that there's certain kinds of, they certainly have positive consequences, but there's also these unintended consequences that we also need to think through. Disruption is painful. And then this last is a quote from an article that Roberto de Rook, who's a research scientist in OER, and I wrote. One thing that's missing is, we tend to forget about the civic side of things, that we also need to think about some of the pressing problems that we face as a planet, that we face as humanity. And a lot of times when we look at the future of work, those sorts of things tend to be left out. We tend to leave out the skills that are necessary to understand the world and others, and to think about power in particular, as Nancy mentioned in the first talk. It's also a story of insecurity to some extent. So when you look at some of the changes and the kinds of disruption, we're seeing that, we're predicting that 47% of today's jobs will be gone in 10 years. They will no longer exist. And we're not quite sure of what the future of work holds for us. 41% already in the United States, again, these are from Deloitte Review, of the workforce is in the crowd or gig economy. And these are temporary jobs. A gig is just a temporary job. It's a project you work on for a while, and then you move on to the next gig. And so it's very piecemeal, okay? And the crowd economy is much more about crowdsourcing and so on. But all new jobs created since 2008, basically we can put into the category of alternative work. They are different forms of work than we had 20, 30 years ago. We're also seeing an increase in service jobs. And if you look at the right-hand side of the diagram, you can see some of the trends that are anticipated. This is leading to greater precarity in terms of insecurity, people not sure what the future holds in terms of employment and jobs. It's also leading to wage stagnation. Gig jobs tend not to pay as much as the traditional jobs that we've seen in the past. Insecurity now is becoming part of an institutional model where we're having, and this will be experienced here, I think, to some extent, that we're constantly being pushed for continuous skills training, this notion of lifelong meritocracy. And it creates a great deal of stress and pressure for us to continually upgrade, to continually change, to continually learn new things. One of my colleagues was in a taxi cab not too long ago, and the taxi driver said, "I'm sick and tired of learning. I don't want to learn anymore." It's like, I've had enough. Like it's hard to keep up, right? It's hard to keep pace. And it's also, we're seeing that this instability, this insecurity is also creating issues around trust and institutional loyalty. So it's not like when my father worked, he worked for Smith Corona typewriters, which are now gone. He worked for them for about 40 years. Those kinds of jobs don't exist anymore. Those sorts of, kind of really solid sort of blue-collar factory jobs just aren't going to be around. So, there was a certain sense of stability and security that he had until computers came along. So what we're seeing is that employees are overwhelmed, a bit stressed out. So these are statistics from the United States, but much more stress, hard to kind of manage time, very difficult. And what we see as a growing trend is actually a focus on well-being, both in workplaces as well as in schools. Oh, I got 5 minutes? Okay. And so that a growing trend, we see that in Singapore too. There's much more emphasis on positive education, positive psychology, well-being. We're very concerned about students' ability to kind of cope, to manage stress, high levels of anxiety. And this is really not an excellent book, but it's an interesting book, Mindfulness, which says that what we're doing is we're individualizing things that are basically institutional and social problems. We're told to meditate, to chill, to, don't worry about it, manage your stress, instead of looking at the sources of those stress. So we see these same things happening in education. So if you look at some of the emerging technologies, we see that it's disrupting the status quo. It certainly brings certain positive effects around affording creativity and greater networking and things of this nature. But in terms of education, again, I'm going to focus more on just the technology trends. We're seeing a lot of e-pedagogies, digital tools, various digital tools, social media being used, visualization technologies like augmented reality, virtual environments, other kinds of technologies as well. AI in education is the latest, biggest trend, and I think here at NIE we're trying to figure out how do we use AI in education. I think all of Singapore is moving heavily into AI. It's seen as a way to address several kinds, if you look at the problems in the left-hand column, several kinds of educational problems AI purports to be able to address in particular kinds of ways. Again, what kinds of stories are conveyed here? There's a certain kind of techno-optimism, again, I think. Again, there's a story of transformation, that classrooms are going to become more personalized, anytime on-the-go sort of learning opportunities, auto-marking, which would make teachers' lives much more pleasant, I think. This story of smart classrooms that really focuses on big data and automated analytics is kind of an emerging story that we're hearing more and more about. So this is a story of what we're referring to as platformization, that we're seeing the platformization of education, that more and more the pedagogical relationships that used to take place in classrooms are happening on platforms. And we draw on, Roberto and I draw on this book, Platform Capitalism. So 3 examples are Google, Amazon Web Services, and Uber. But what they do is they enable massive amounts of data to be collected and tracked and analytics to be run. And it also relies on certain kinds of algorithms to produce these analytics. And all of you are going to be familiar, are probably already familiar with Blackboard, right? So that's one kind of platform. It's a digital infrastructure that brings together teachers and students for different kinds of interactions, pedagogical interactions. And then what we see, and it's a good thing I'm running out of time, because if I started talking about Workday, I would just, I'd go into a rant. But we see these accountability platforms where they serve bureaucratic functions, basically. And we have several of them. This is just a couple of examples. We have our publications and research database, which is used for appraisal purposes, and then the workload system, Workday, is being used to manage labor. And the impact that we're seeing is there's increasingly this measurement fetish. It's more and more about measuring every aspect of academic work in terms of output and so on. And what it does is it centralizes administrative processes, and basically it allows people to control individuals and groups when they're not directly involved in the work that's being done. And mostly it's for efficiency's sake. So I'll have to go, I'm really way behind. Okay, so we're looking at a couple of different platforms in Singapore. One is the student learning space, but Roberto and I have done an article in Cognition and Instruction on My Skills Future, which I think many of you are familiar with. So it's a national program, one-stop education portal. And I'm going to share just a couple of features, but you'll see some of the storylines here are to develop skills, student skills, that skills are a global currency of the 21st century, and so on. And here, just this gives you a sense of how it's really, very appealing to young people. It's quite engaging through the use of video and games. You can see it's designed like a game board where students are kind of recruited into thinking about their own interests, and it's kind of a process of self-discovery. And here's the industry landscape that's provided. And really what it does is it tries to map industry skills to students. So it's the ministry acts as a broker between basically industry needs and student learning. And this is quite an interesting diagram to deconstruct, but we won't go there for now. So one of the things that we're finding is, and it's important to think about when we look at these platforms, they're never neutral, and technologies are never neutral. They're always embedded with their creators' ideologies. And they tend to reproduce certain kinds of system tendencies, like hierarchical relationships or power relationships. They use the same kinds of data and metrics typically. And there's something that's known as algorithmic bias, that these metrics and the algorithms that are used in these platforms also convey the biases that the creators have when they create the technology or the algorithms. And it's also leading to a new logic of learning, which is really focused on what we're calling entrepreneurial citizenship, where 21st century skills are really about employability. They're about jobs, exclusively almost, to some extent, I guess. And so now I'm gonna wrap up very quickly. So one of the things that I guess is a way of conclusion is that stories have consequences. So we need to think about the kinds of stories that young people are being pulled into, because they shape how we view the world. And we need to be a bit more critical in our readings. We need to kind of interrogate these stories. We need to interrogate these trends. We need to ask, what is this doing? Whose purposes are being served here? What's the experiences that young people are having with these technologies or platforms? And can we broaden and deepen meaning? This is kind of the turning away, I think, that Nancy mentioned. Can we move beyond the instrumental job skills focus, technocratic solutions, narrow views of students and measurement, to fuller conceptions of human potential? Can we think more broadly about students as humans with a range of capabilities, interests, aspirations? And can we create more satisfying stories? And so, in closing, this is from Eugene Tan, who says that Singapore is facing an existential, post-material existential crisis, and that how Singapore addresses these sort of aspirational concerns, especially of young Singaporeans, is going to be really pretty key here. And Marianne asked me, she found this quote from the article that Roberto and I had done, and said, could you speak to that? And so I think in terms of you as graduate students, as you either embark on this journey or continue on the journey, I think it's important to ask yourself, what new, more satisfying stories might you create and enact? What are the stories of your lives? What are the collective stories about the work that you're doing and what it means to be both a student as well as an educator and a scholar or a researcher? What will be the questions that you'll ask? So I'm kind of paraphrasing from the quote. What will be the consequences of your work and the decisions that you make? Kind of think through what some of those consequences are. And really think about the nature of the social relationships that you want to have, because it's really about building a different kind of culture, I think, in terms of thinking about education and its purposes, and then what type of world will you build. A little bit of a plug here, a shameless plug for, I think this is a turning away that, like Nancy mentioned, I think this presents a different story. This is NIE's For Life framework, and as you can see, from the first one, lifelong, it is really about connecting learning to purpose. It's about purpose and meaning. So it's not just focused on, kind of the narrow, preparation of young people for employability. It's getting young people to think about purpose. It's about intentional learning beyond the self into broader communities, and to thinking about real-world connections. So you'll have, I think, plenty of opportunity to kind of explore this, but maybe you can think about your own research in these areas in terms of lifelong, life deep, life wise, or life wide. I do have some references, since you're all graduate students. It's important to make sure you cite. And one more shameless plug, and that is for our Redesigning Pedagogy Conference coming up June 1st and 3rd. And you can even still get in abstracts. It'd be a great thing for you to do as graduate students. It's a proposal that is just an abstract. It doesn't require a whole lot. You have until Monday, though. That's your homework. Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we've got Nancy with me. She's raised issues of power, new conceptions of youth, challenging us with new conceptions of curriculum beyond the narrow curriculum. We've got Mark with me, challenging us to come up with new stories. And so, as new graduate students here at NIE, we're inviting you to join us in co-generative dialogue. So we've got microphones along the aisle, but if you feel that your voice is loud enough and you've got a pressing question, please start. We've got, I think, just under 10 minutes to do a short panel with some questions that you may have. Yes, please.
I'm not sure if I'm loud enough. Should I be using the microphone?
I think it's okay, we can hear you.
Okay, so my name is Lily. I got a question. I'm interested to know what Professor Lesko has shared regarding the zero tolerance and then not to use uniformity and stuff. I work in my home country at a training agency, which is part of a Ministry of Finance government. And even teaching andragogy, we still use rules, sometimes quite strict of them, and uniformity and stuff. I just wonder whether these involving your learners in the curriculum making and having non-strict rules will actually help even more so in educating adults. Yeah.
So a question about the zero tolerance policy,
Yes.
right? And in the school system.
in more of an adult learning
Right.
level, the undergoes.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I would. I think if we think about in a very kind of basic way, who has an impact on what to sort of draw on Mark's presentation, to sort of what stories we tell about young people and their capabilities and what they might be capable of and able to be interested in, and how they might show participation in society, that the folks who are in charge of that are generally the adults, as far as I can tell. So I think, I agree with you. How to do that is, I think, getting, right, it's hard. It's hard to get us to look at our own practices in a critical way. So it sort of also kind of ties in with this idea of different kinds of stories so yeah, I would just second your idea. And how to do it, I think, is kind of my sense is working informally, that formalized settings, in the US we call them professional development, may play a part, but that a reading group among teachers to sort of like focus on just one article or chapters of a book, I think are a way to begin to bring some new ideas in, and then I think another practice that seems to be really helpful is teachers being able to visit each other's classrooms, and that's another kind of a possibility for generative dialogue. So it's like sort of opening some spaces and times where some other ideas can enter.
So perhaps that could be a topic for your dissertation, right? Okay. So another, maybe we have time for maybe 2 questions or 3 at most. So please keep your questions short. Do you want to use the mic? Because I'm not sure if we can hear you.
Hi, thanks. I work in the innovation creative space with the youth and teenagers. So I completely agree with almost everything you guys are saying, but similar to what the lady said up front is trying to create this dialogue to make those changes and moving away from the items you mentioned. But I think a big difference in Asia is that you mentioned broken windows. I find that working both in Singapore and in Japan, that a lot of the rules are actually not built to veer them away from this kind of bad future or things that they may do that's detrimental. It's more of a cultural thing, and when you talk to the schools about making these changes, they tend to fall back on, oh, but this is culture. Especially when I was working in Japan, they'll say, oh, but that's part of the culture. If I want a classroom of students who don't sit at their desk, they would actually say, no, the culture is for them to sit down. So I would like to pose to everybody, actually, when you want to create that dialogue, not even like implementing the change, but creating that dialogue, but then when something as big as culture presents itself, how can we keep on stimulating that?
Well, a quick response from me would be that cultures aren't static. They never have been. Language, for one, just aspect of culture, is not static. It's always evolving and changing. So that would be one. I have a feeling that Mark has other ideas, though.
Yeah, I think I tend to draw on Anthony Kwame Appiah's work. He has a nice article in the New York Times called "The Art of Social Change," and he actually talks about changes that took place in China around foot binding. And I think he has three main points. One is that it has to start from a dialogue of mutual respect, that there has to be this respect for traditions, cultures, but there's a need for different kinds of models. Gerard Yee, we interviewed, I think it's okay to mention his name, right? Yeah. One of the people that we interviewed just a couple of days ago also talked about the power of models, and that creating something new, trying it out so that other people can see it and then having other people say, yeah, that gets results, that works, and adopting it. And so I think if you can come up with alternatives that you can demonstrate have some kind of impact, I do think that's one way to maybe encourage people to kind of try different things out. And
I think the interview also prompted me to think about what Gerard said, which is to go back, Simon Sinek, go back to the why do we exist question, and that's really important because that goes back to fundamental issues about purpose and meaning. So it's not just about the mission statement of organizations that nobody reads about, but who are the people we serve? The students in our organization, the teachers, or other people. And then, tenaciously using that as a driver for change, even cultural change. Yeah.
It will go on, but never mind. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think we have time for maybe just one more question because we've got a packed orientation program right after, and with introductions by the dean and briefings and so on. So one more question for Mark or Nancy.
Time for tea or something?
That's time for tea. Right. So could you join me again to thank our speakers, Professor Nancy Lesko and Mark Gilbert. So this, I think, gives you a taster, hopefully, of what graduate education is about. Always raising lots of questions and getting you to think about these things some more. And we're happy to invite you to tea right after and make some new friends and continue these conversations. And I just want to make a plug here too. The reason why we're having the NIE TC Symposium, because we have the NIE Teachers College Master of Arts in Leadership and Education Change Program. We've been running it for the past 7 to 8 years. We have our new students here, and we're pending the renewal of the Memorandum of Understanding between the two institutions. We may have the last run of that program in 2021. So if you or you know of somebody who's interested in the program, please come up to me. We're happy to talk about the program and connect you with people during tea. All right, so thank you again, Nancy and Mark, and congrats again. We'll see you outside. Please pick up your welcome pack and student cards and come right back in at 5:20 or just before, because we have the welcome by our dean. Right, so thank you.